When I first started this video series, I said we were going to cover the subject from soup to nuts. I would guess that means this unit is the nuts. This is the final collection of topics that I wanted to cover. Unit 12 really is knitting some of the pieces together and drawing some conclusions. And, well, you just have to wait till we do that. I was going to say the conclusion is a pretty amazing conclusion, but we're going to have to wait till we get to that to hear that. So here we are at Unit 11. As I said, we kind of have a collection of odds and ends here, but I think these are very interesting odds and ends. Let's dig into it a little bit. Early on in the series, we talked a lot about dreams and dreaming, and we talked about lucid dreams. The difference between lucid dreams and dreams are in lucid dreams you are aware that you're dreaming. Maybe, I don't know whether that seems like a big deal or a little deal, but I will say the lucid dreaming is really an amazing skill that potentially ties into many of these other kinds of things, especially and ties into a major enabler for out-of-body experiences. Jürgen Zerway, who I'm sure I'm mangling his name, but that guy who did the Multi-Dimensional Man book has said many times in a lot of his different interviews that he uses lucid dreaming to attain the states that he gets to. I mentioned that he does a lot of meditating, and meditating was his primary doorway. That is correct, he does do a lot of meditating, but the methodology he uses to separate from his body has really tended to migrate toward lucid dreaming versus just pure meditation. As a matter of fact, in some cases, his process, he enters a lucid dream, and very often he will meditate from within a lucid dream, which allows him to attain apparently very, very advanced high levels of consciousness, high states of consciousness. So dreaming is a real big deal. Lucid dreaming is a big, big deal. First topic I want to talk about here, though, is shared dreams. So Robert Monroe, as we discussed earlier, was really the father of out-of-body experiences in terms of experimenting with them and studying them, developing hemisync, which is a pretty significant tool in our toolbox, in our collection of tools to be able to study and experience out-of-body. The Monroe Institute is actually a school, if you will, a training center, if you will, in Faber, Virginia. I'm doing this recording in July 2017, and still as of this date, it is one of the leading training institutes, if you want to call it that, educational institutes specializing in the astral. They started off with pretty much studying and training people to do out-of-body experiences. They have really grown that catalog of course offerings to include remote viewing and lucid dreaming and other kinds of and many others. I'm not going to try to go through and recall all the different courses that they have, but they probably have, at this point, 20 different course offerings that they can provide. I didn't really talk too much about exactly how they go about their training, and I'll just mention it just for a second here for those people who are interested. This is it's set in a beautiful spot in the mountains in Virginia, and it's a multiple building setting. One of the buildings has offices and a laboratory where they do a lot of their advanced work. And the main building has a library or two in it, and a lot of accommodations for students, a kitchen, a living room that they use for presentations, and they also have an auditorium, all the different types of things you'd expect in an academic setting. And they've got facilities, I want to say, for something like maybe 18 or 20 people. In this main building, they have a couple of dormitory-style rooms set up, maybe 3 or 4 of these rooms set up. In each of the rooms, the accommodations for each particular person includes this thing that they call a check unit. And check is a acronym for something that I can't recall at this moment, but it's essentially an isolation booth. But it's incorporated. Your bed is incorporated into this booth. So when you go to bed at night, you pull a curtain on your bed. It's all enclosed, and it has lighting built into this bed, lighting and speakers, and also headphones. So and you end up spending a lot of time in that check unit during the day when you're doing various different exercises. So you'll end up getting up in the morning, taking a shower, getting cleaned up, going to a lecture for maybe an hour, and then you'll go spend whatever, maybe 45 minutes in your check unit practicing whatever the skill was that you talked about in the lecture. Then you'll go back to the lecture, you'll compare notes, you'll do a debrief, you'll cover a new topic, and then you'll go back to your check unit. So you're going in and out of that unit multiple times during the day, and it's essentially an isolation booth. It's a darkened booth with, as I said, these audio tools built into it. So that just gives you a general idea what goes on at the Monroe Institute. Highly recommended. It's a great way to get away from it all and focus just purely on teaching yourself this new skill. Most of these programs they have are either weekend programs or 6-day programs. I think I mentioned in some early unit that it was a 10-day program, and that's not correct. It's usually a 6-day program. You arrive on a day, you spend 6 days, you leave. They spend a day cleaning up and preparing for the next class, and then the next 6-day class starts. So that's how it works. So there's a lot of when you're at one of these training programs, especially one of the advanced training programs where they've got very, very skilled students, they're doing really kind of amazing exercises. And one of the exercises that they've been doing for the last few years, especially with advanced students, is shared out-of-body experiences. And a lot of them, I'm just referring to it as shared dreams, but I think, it's shared out-of-body experience, shared dream. Let's just sort of use those two descriptions as meaning the same thing. What happens is 2 or more people will agree to meet at a certain place, and they may agree to what they're going to try to accomplish or do at that certain place. And then they will go off to their check units. They will go through whatever their personal preparation is, and it's sort of usually it's a meditative in nature, and usually being at the Monroe Institute, it usually involves some sort of a hemisync audio, brain synchronization aspect as well. What they do is they both go into this state, go out of body, and you can think of that as dreaming if you want, or just think of it as going out of body. And what they do is now that they're both, or not, I shouldn't just say both, sometimes there's 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 people that are agreeing to try to meet. And all those people that are doing this will endeavor to meet at this particular location. Very often the location they meet at is the crystal. There is an amazing crystal at the facility. It's a beautiful quartz crystal, literally the size of a man, and it's a beautiful thing. Crystals, of course, are known to contain lots and lots of energies and healing powers, etc. And so very often these people agree to meet at the crystal. And there have been several accounts of people meeting at the crystal, having conversations, and doing things. For example, they might meet there and then do a retrieval. I was talking in a previous unit about what a retrieval is, but for those who haven't heard that, a retrieval is when someone goes out of body and finds a person who has deceased, but their spirit is kind of stuck in a realm close to the earthly realm and hasn't really transitioned completely to an afterlife kind of a realm. And these people who do this retrieve this person and take them to their final destination. Essentially picks them up and guides them to the destination that they were trying to get to originally, which is, we'll just call it heaven for lack of a better term. So there's been lots of cases where retrievals have been done or conversations have been had or other kinds of adventures, joint experiences have been had in these kinds of environments. And what happens is they go and do this, and then they return back to their check unit. They wake up, and the first thing you always do after one of these experiences is usually take some notes, whatever things you can remember, before you even leave your check unit. Take as detailed notes as you can. And usually that's because just the nature of some of these experiences, especially dreams, tend to be very fleeting. And if you don't get them down quickly, you might forget some of the nuance of it. So these people do this. They have their joint experience. They go back to their check unit. They take their notes. Then they meet at whatever, they meet wherever, and they compare their notes. And there have been many, many cases where the experiences from multiple of these people have matched, which is pretty amazing. And really what it does is, that's a very, very evidential thing, because there's lots of theories from skeptics about the fact that these experiences that we're talking about are mental experiences or imaginary experiences. And any of these mental or imaginary experiences would essentially be very personal things. And these are not things that could be shared. And so the idea that one of these experiences could be shared by multiple people really validates the fact that this is not just someone's personal imagination that's dreaming this all up. It's a more objective kind of environment and an objective experience that has objective reality outside someone's personal imagination. That's huge. So this isn't just some little nitpicking thing, some little triviality. This has enormous impact in terms of the kinds of experiences we're talking about and how valid they are. All right, so again, I'm calling them shared dreams. You can call them shared non-physical experiences, might actually be a better way to put it. There is also a group of people who have taken the Monroe Institute Gateway program and other more advanced programs. And this group, I think they call it the Dolphin Club or the Dolphin Group. I believe that's how they refer to it as. And these are people who make themselves available to help other people in the non-physical. And that might be a retrieval or many other different types of assistance they could provide. And I believe it's part of this group. If not, it's part of some other group where people who have gone to the Monroe program, the Gateway program, or other even more advanced programs, have agreed to meet at certain times in certain places in the non-physical. And these are not people who go to their check unit and sit down and meditate. You're going to have one person in one city and one person in another city, or maybe 10 people in various cities who all agree to meet at a certain time and place. And either they just fall asleep in lucid dream, or they go out of body using the Monroe protocols, and they meet and they compare notes. And there's been lots of cases where people have compared these notes and have demonstrated that they've had the same experience. So this isn't just something that happens at the Monroe Institute particularly. This is something that can happen generally between anybody. There are websites, and often these people are Monroe alumni, but they don't need to be. There are websites where people make an agreement to meet at a certain place and time, and anyone who is interested, who wants to try to meet them, can. And I will endeavor. I'm sure I can find a link to one or more of these websites and provide it in the resource material, so that if someone wanted to try this, they could. To me, that's pretty momentous stuff. Very, very evidential. Very, very important to really prove the truth of these techniques. So that's shared dreams, shared OBEs. Next one. Oh, by the way, one thing, and again, I'm going to put this in the resource material. A lot of people who have taken the Monroe courses have gone on to develop very, very in-depth skills. For example, Several of the people, Joe McGonigal is probably the most notable, but several other people who were early practitioners with Robert Monroe ended up developing significant skills and have practiced them, after, for years after they left the Monroe Institute. One of these skills, and it's not anywhere in my curriculum, but it just comes to mind, is the Stargate program for the U.S. Army. That program was a real program in the U.S. Army. Joe McGonigal was a part of this group. Several other people were a part of this group that were graduates of the Monroe Institute. And this group was all about remote viewing. This is the group that, people that top secret missions would be given to this group. For example, I believe at one point a Russian bomber turned up missing at one point back in the 70s or 80s. The Russian bomber turned up missing, and the Russian bomber had a nuke on it, and no one in the world knew what happened to this plane. And so it was very important that they find it so they could secure the nuke. And so they gave this as an assignment to Stargate, this secret group within the Army. And essentially what you do is you give these people their assignment, you tell them what it is that they're looking for, and I don't know whether multiple people do it or they just simply choose one person from the Stargate program. I think they will choose one person. And he goes into this sort of trance meditative kind of a state and concentrates, and very often can actually see it, find it, give you coordinates for it. And in fact, they did find this plane. It was down somewhere in Africa. I forget exactly where, but they pinpointed it using the Stargate program. And there are many, many other projects that Stargate worked on that were successful. Stargate has since been disbanded, not sure why, but it was very successful for years. Joe McGonigal has written a book on the topic. I'll list it in the references. So Joe has written a book. Many other Monroe Institute alumni have written books on their experiences after leaving the Monroe Institute. So if you're interested in the skills that you can learn at the Monroe Institute, whether they're real, what they're like, you can actually not only go to the Monroe Institute and find lots of material, you can actually read quite a few books written by graduates of the Institute. Okay, so we're going to move on now to the next topic, and that's end-of-life lucidity. And what that is all about is the following. Lots of people suffer very low lucidity in the end of their life. I'm specifically talking about, for example, Alzheimer's patients. I'm talking about people like my mother who suffered quite a few strokes and mini strokes and TIAs over the last 6 or 7 or 8 or 10 years of her life, and she had lower and lower and lower mental acuity towards the end of her life, and that happens quite a bit with older people. The phenomenon that we're talking about here has been witnessed by lots of caregivers and family members throughout the millennia. And what they've noticed is very often there will be someone who is profoundly limited, either because of strokes, because of disease like Alzheimer's, or even other kinds of diseases that might affect the brain, long-term sort of mental retardation kinds of limitations that are imposed on patients. And what has been witnessed many times is a person will have that level of dementia, that level of limitation, all of a sudden will sit up in their bed and start talking clearly in full sentences to the people around them. These are people who haven't talked in maybe months or years, all of a sudden sit up and have a conversation. And very often what this is in very close proximity to dying. So they will become alert, they will become conscious, they will have dialogue. They may have a 3 or 4 hour conversation with their wife or husband or child or mother or father, whoever it might be, and then at that point slip into unconsciousness and die. The doctors look at patients like this and explain their condition by explaining the fact that there's permanent irreparable damage to their brain in some fashion, and that the brain can no longer support higher level functions. And so the the interesting thing is when this sort of thing happens, it really shoots a gigantic hole in that whole argument. It shoots a hole in the fact that the brain is the only thing to consider when it comes to having these cognitive abilities. And I'm not sure how doctors have responded to end of life lucidity. They probably, if I know doctors, if I know technical people, material reductionist kinds of people, they explain it by sort of waving their arms and go, well, that's just an anomaly. Obviously, their brain wasn't really that badly damaged. That's just an outlier case, and we're not really going to worry about it. That's what scientists always tend to do when when data doesn't fit their argument, is they tend to throw the data out. That's end of life lucidity. I just wanted people to know what the term meant. You can go in and search for cases of it. And like I said, it's a pretty important phenomenon in terms of refuting the typical scientific view that the brain is everything. And if it was, then we wouldn't be able to see these kinds of events happen. End of life lucidity. Okay, next, the Scole experiments. Scole, the Scole experiments. This is quite a story, and it's all documented in a book, and it's also documented in a YouTube video that's, I want to say at least an hour long. It might be a couple hours long. The YouTube is actually it's a YouTube version of a television documentary that was done on the subject. There's a town in the UK somewhere named Scole, and I may have my dates wrong, but who cares? And I believe this happened in the 1970s or so is when it started. Some people who lived there created a little room in their cellar, in their basement, and they started doing seances there. And it's the typical seance. They had a few chairs and a table and maybe a couple of candles, and they would sit down and have a seance, turn off the lights, and do the whole seance thing. And they started getting some really amazing things happening. They had visitations, they heard voices, all kinds of things. And so they ended up creating kind of a little regular group that would meet for these seances, maybe a half a dozen people. And they really decided, because they were seeing some pretty amazing things, they started to take real pains to make sure that they controlled and managed this environment so that they could eliminate as much as possible the possibility of hoaxes. So, for example, they would lock the door whenever the 6 people were in the room, and there was only one way in and out of the room, and it was the doorway that went upstairs, is that they would bolt that door so only those 6 people could be in the room. They would take all kinds of pains to make sure that no one could bring any objects into the room, that whatever. They would take as many precautions as they could to keep people from fooling anybody. And what they ended up getting into, the most amazing part of the Scole experiments, started to get into what's referred to as physical mediumship. And that is that not only can people talk to the dead, but that they could end up with physical evidence of that communication with the dead, which most scientists, most materialists would say that's impossible. It's one thing to have crackpot say that they talked to their dead grandmother. It's a whole other thing for that crackpot to say, look, here's a piece of physical evidence that proves that I talked with my grandmother. So what kinds of evidence are we talking about? Well, there's a lot of photographic evidence, and so they came up with this. One of the guys was a woodworker and I think an inventor and a tinkerer, and he came up with a special box that you could put unopened film in and put the box on the table. They could communicate with the entities. And actually the interesting thing is the entities specifically asked them to get some film so that they could use it to show evidence. So It wasn't that the people sitting around the table decided this would be a good idea. If I remember correctly, the entities themselves said that this would be a good idea. And if you go to the Scole Experiments website, or if you look at the documentary, or if you get the book like I did and read the book, you'll see dozens of pictures in this book that are from the deceased. And the way this worked is they had a really specific protocol that they developed so that they could eliminate the possibility as much as possible of fraud. And actually, several of the people, they would always be inviting people to their seances that were college professors and physicists and PhDs and et cetera, notable people who were in some cases skeptics. They would invite to witness what was going on and to comment on the protocols that they were coming up with to make sure that the protocols that they were using were as carefully designed as possible. So the photographic ones were one of the ones that they spent the most time on. And so the way it worked is they would go to a photography shop. This was back when they actually used film for photography. They would go to a photography shop and they would buy several boxes of film. And these are sealed boxes. For any photographers out there, you know what they look like. It's a little cardboard sealed box, glued shut. Inside is a plastic tub with a plastic top, and inside that is film rolled up into a little canister. And so in many cases, not only would they buy a box of film, they'd buy an entire sleeve. There's 6 boxes of film that come within one of these packages. And so you've got the outside seal, and then each one of the inside boxes are sealed, etc. And so what they would do is they would buy either one of these little boxes or one of these cartons of film. They would take the sealed box of film and they would put it into this wooden box that had a lock on it. So take this sealed box of film, put it in the wooden box that was designed and built by one of the Scole people. They would put a padlock on it, and it was totally locked, and they would sit it right in the middle of the table. And they would do their seance, and then originally they would take that film and have it developed, but then skeptics would say, yeah, well, you took it to have it developed. Maybe the people who were developing were in on the hoax, and they ended up, playing around with the film and doing bad things. So what they did is they ended up buying Polaroid, I think it was Polaroid or Kodak, one of the big photography companies back then, had a little home development kit, and it was a box with chemicals in it. And so what you would do is you would take the film take your film out of your camera, you'd put it into a little canister, a special canister for developing film. And so you'd go into a darkroom, you'd take that film, you'd put it into the special canister, you'd put the canister in the developer, you'd push whatever buttons or levers or whatever happened, and an hour later you would have the developed negatives that you could look at and see the results of. And the results are amazing. There are photographs of people in there, of the dead people in there, photographs of buildings and cities, and all different kinds of photographs. Also, other kinds of photographs of documents, photographs of special characters, all sorts of interesting things that there are photographs of. And if you take a look at the Scole experiment, take a look at those photographs, you'll be pretty amazed. Now it goes beyond that. They had lights whizzing around the room, going underneath the table and all over the place. They would have, tables and chairs up in the air moving around. And these are all things that have been witnessed by not only the standard Scole group, but also the people who were invited to witness this. The Scole group came to the United States for a series of seances that was held in California, and they had some NASA scientists come to witness this. And I believe in every case, I don't think there's any exceptions, the people who came to witness these events were all convinced. There's one more occurrence that I would specifically note, and that is, and this gets really wild, there's a word called a port, A-P-O-R-T. And a port is when a non-physical being can deliver a physical object to you. And this happened multiple times in the Scole experiments. As I remember, there were a couple of cases of pieces of jewelry that, they'd be sitting around this table, and unfortunately it was in the dark because that's the way the seances work. If it's too bright in the room, the seance won't work. They would all of a sudden hear this clunk, and they would turn the lights on, and they would see this object sitting on the table, and it was a brooch or some other piece of jewelry from the ghost, from the departed. That's pretty interesting. You could say that maybe someone brought it in and took it out of their pocket and put it on the table, and they took pains to make sure that wouldn't happen, but I suppose that's always possible. A coin was delivered at one point, which was a mint perfect condition coin from, that was 200 years old or something. But one of the most interesting apports was they heard this clunk at one of these seances, and they turned on the lights, and there was a newspaper sitting there in the middle of the table. It was a brand new newspaper that looked like it was essentially just printed. But when they looked at the newspaper, it was from, I'm just going to say it was 75 years previous. Who knows? Maybe it was 25 years or whenever it was. It was a decade or more old. The newspaper wasn't yellowed. It showed no age whatsoever. It looked like a brand new newspaper. The interesting thing for anyone who watches any of these crime shows on TV, there are very, very specific tests that you can run on paper and ink to make sure that this paper and this ink are really from the time frame that you are specifying. Apparently, ink and paper have very specific chemical compositions, and that chemical composition changes over the years as the printing technology improved. And they took this newspaper to an expert in just these very things and asked them what they thought, and the person was flabbergasted. Basically what the person said was, this newspaper paper material and this ink is absolutely from the time frame that you're talking about. The problem is, this newspaper could not be from that time frame because it hasn't aged. It absolutely looks exactly like it has all the correct sort of chemical properties and visual properties of a newspaper from that time. The only problem is it doesn't look old, and we don't understand why that isn't the case. So anyways, that's the long and the short of the Scole experiments. So not only, we've been talking about these odd non-physical aspects to our world. What I'm talking about now is that these odd non-physical aspects of our world apparently can reach back into our world in a physical way. And that's a surprise to a lot of people. All right, so that's what the Scole experiments are all about. Next, plant consciousness. And this could be a long story if I don't work hard to keep it a short story. So I will do exactly that. Plant consciousness. The person who invented the lie detector did some experiments at one point, applying the technology of the lie detector to plants, just to see how plants would respond. And essentially what they were expecting to find is that there's some electrical activity within a plant that may or may not show similarities to the electrical activity in a person. What they found went way, way beyond that. And there is a book that describes this in a lot of detail, and of course I will point this book out to you. But what this person did, and I'm shortening this story way down to keep it brief, is they instrumented the plant and found that yes, in fact, there is electrical activity going on in the plant that is similar to a human. What they found was that electrical activity would vary based on some unknown input. So sometimes it'd be very erratic and very pronounced, and other times it'd be very sedate. And they did a lot of experimenting to figure out what was going on. Long story into a short story, they ended up with an experiment where what they did is they instrumented a plant, and they ended up taking a cigarette, a lit cigarette, and burning the leaf. And when they burned the leaf, they would see all these, all this erratic electrical activity. And so it really looked like the plant was demonstrating that it had some sort of a nervous system, which surprised a lot of people. So that essentially what they're saying is plants seem to feel pain, which was a surprise to a lot of people. But throughout these experiments, what they found out was, as they were doing more of these experiments, what they found is when they lit a cigarette and they were about to burn the plant, that all of a sudden these erratic disturbances would happen before they burnt the plant. So it seemed like the plant was anticipating being burnt and was reacting as if it was being burnt before it was being burnt. Well, that's very interesting. But they went further than that. They actually did an experiment that didn't involve a cigarette or a match at all. It involved a person saying that they were going to burn the plant. They had the intention of burning the plant, and they found that the plant reacted to that intention. So just the thought that someone was about to light a match and burn the plant was enough for the plant to react. Figure that one out. The story goes longer and deeper, and it'll be in my book. By the way, I'm writing a book that really covers all this material in much, much more detail. So the story goes a lot deeper and wider and has a lot more nuance and a lot more information in it. But just that information right there should surprise a lot of people. That people have been saying for years that if you take a plant and play soft, beautiful music as opposed to harsh rock music, for example, or if you take a plant, two identical plants with the same light and the same water and the same environment, and you tell one plant that you love it, and you tell the other plant that you hate it, the one you told you love does better. And yes, there are actually scientific tests that have proven this. So plants do respond to, obviously they respond to more light and more water and more care, but they actually respond to emotional kinds of inputs like I hate you, I love you. Yes, it's true. I wasn't going to get into it, but it just comes to mind that there are also ice experiments, ice crystal experiments, and these were really started in Japan, where what they would do is they would take a beaker of water, 2 beakers of water. They'd take 1 beaker of water, they would pour half in one beaker and half in another. So now they got 2 beakers of water that are from the same source. And they would take 1 beaker and put it in one place and take the other beaker and put it in another place. And they would talk to one beaker in a very pleasant way. They would expose it to music or other kinds of beautiful, nice input. And they would expose the other beaker to harsh input, either harsh noises, harsh light, language, negative emotions, etc. And then what they would do is they would take a little bit of water from each of those beakers, put it onto a slide and freeze it, and look at the slide under a microscope. And what they would find is on the slide from the loving water, you would see beautiful crystalline structures emerge when it was frozen. And in the other case where the hateful emotions were exposed, where the water was exposed to hateful emotions, you would freeze the water and it would be these ugly, jagged, kinds of crystalline structures. There's no similarity whatsoever to the more beautiful crystalline structures from the water that was loved. Not only does this non-physical emotional connection apply to living beings, not to animals, it also applies to plants, but it also applies to what you would not consider to be a living being at all, which is water. So it seems like it's possible that this connection we have to the non-physical goes beyond humans, and it even goes beyond life. It's some very fundamental force that we're dealing with. Okay? So that's plant consciousness. I want to mention, speaking of plants, a plant called ayahuasca. Ayahuasca is one of a family of natural substances like mescaline and peyote and other kinds of substances that have been used by primitive cultures for eons. And this one, ayahuasca, is really found in the Amazon down in South America. It's actually a combination of a couple of plants. And you grab some of this vine and you grab some of these leaves and you crunch it all together and you add a lot of water and you cook it for however many hours and it creates this nasty brown gross liquid that you can drink. And shamans have been doing this in South America for, I don't know, thousands of years. And they've been doing healing ceremonies using this for thousands of years. And again, you could talk for 2 hours on this one subject, so I'm going to try to keep it to 5 minutes if I can. What they found is that a lot of people in the last, say, 10 to 15 years have been traveling down to South America, onto the Amazon, into Peru, to try to access these shamans. And there are shamans down there that this is how they survive, is they do ayahuasca ceremonies, healing ceremonies for gringos. What people have found is they have recovered from awful health issues, awful traumatic psychological issues, addictions, all sorts of things through the use of this ayahuasca treatment. Ayahuasca is this nasty tasting foul brew that when you drink it makes you end up throwing up and having diarrhea, and so it's not a pleasant experience. It's not like anyone would do this just for the high. They're doing it for the healing properties of ayahuasca. The interesting thing is with ayahuasca is that again there are beings, there are entities that seem to be manifested somehow through the ayahuasca. And I think they refer to it as Mother Ayahuasca. They refer to it as a person. And the interesting thing is a lot of people who do this ayahuasca end up having a similar visual representation of this entity. It's a multicolored, almost reptilian-looking entity. And people who have not known that it's reptilian or had any experience with ayahuasca, or anyone who's ever taken ayahuasca, have had this similar experience. So there seems to be this sort of objective, somewhat consistent experience behind how ayahuasca, appears and how it works. So I'm not going to try to get into any of the healing stories. There are many. I will again put some links so you can follow them if you like. This is available to anyone who wants to travel down to the Amazon and drink this nasty stuff and throw up and sort of go through this process. There is an unbelievable history here of treatment and healing through ayahuasca. Okay? By the way, ayahuasca, Ayahuasca, ayahuasca. All right, so the last thing I want to talk about is, in some ways, maybe the strangest thing. I'm calling it paired life / dual life experiences. What does that mean? Well, I had an instructor at the Monroe Institute who helped us through learning to do astral projection. And she has been doing this for something like 20 years and has lots of experience with lots of spiritual practices. She told me after a few days of getting to know her at lunch one day, she told me I asked her about maybe some of the odd things that have occurred to her through the years in these practices. And she had many, but she shared this particular one that really struck home with me. What it was is one day when she woke up in the morning, she ended up not recognizing the room that she woke up in. It was totally foreign. She got out of bed and looked out the window and didn't recognize anything she was seeing. She was in a completely different place, a different house, a different place. She walked out of her bedroom door and kind of found her way to the kitchen because she was in a house she had never been in before. So she was just kind of wandering around a little bit and found her way to the kitchen. And there was a person there making coffee. And the person turned to him and said something along the lines of, "Hi, honey, here's your coffee." So it was a man. And so apparently this man thought that she was his wife. She doesn't recognize the man, but apparently the man recognized her. So she had been involved in some odd things in the past, so she just kind of kept her mouth shut and tried to take it all in and figure it out quietly. So she took a few sips of her coffee, excused herself, went into the bathroom, looked in the bathroom mirror, and the person in the mirror staring back at her was not her. It was a different person altogether. Apparently, she had swapped bodies with someone in the night. And even for her, someone who had been through some odd experiences, this was a kind of a freak out. She went back to her room, climbed into bed, pulled the covers over her head, and tried as hard as she could to sort of, click her heels back together again and leave Oz and go home, right? There's no place like home. There's no place like home. Well, I don't know how she eventually did it, but she eventually ended up back in her home. That was the first time that happened. It turns out that it has happened many times since. Apparently, she has some type of a connection at some level with this other woman, and these two swap bodies every once in a while. It's completely unpredictable when it's going to happen. She hasn't figured out why it happens, when it's going to happen, how long it's going to last. But she's apparently, her and the other woman have figured out a way to just deal with it. She knows where this other house, where this other woman lives. It's in California somewhere. She knows the street address, and she knows she knows all the basic information about this other woman's life because she's traded places with her so many times. But there you go. Pretty odd behavior, right? There's another example of that. I mentioned in an earlier unit a guy by the name of Hank Wesselman, who is an anthropologist and a shamanic practitioner. His book, Spirit Walker, spends an entire book talking about this idea of swapping bodies back and forth. Only in the case of Hank Wesselman, he was actually ended up finding himself in the body of another person. He end up switching bodies with someone who is like a great grandson of his. And so he can see through this person's body, he can see and witness and experience everything that this person is experiencing. And at the time when he's flashing forward and in this person's body, seeing what's going on a few hundred years from now, this person is actually in his body. And imagine this person now is looking into his past and is understanding the past. It's way too big a story to try to tell here and now, but let's just say this. This person, and I'm going to say it's 300 years in the future because I'm not exactly sure how many years. Let's say it's 300 years in the future. The world looks very different 300 years in the future. The United States looks very different 300 years in the future. And the reason it does is because some gigantic climatic changes that happened, and the melting of the ice caps and the rising of the oceans. The oceans have gone up in this particular time period. It turns out the oceans had risen like hundreds of feet, which really changed a lot of things and really destroyed society almost completely. Instead of being 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 billion people in the world, there's a few million people in the world several hundred years from now. And so the people several hundred years from now had really had no technology whatsoever. All the technology was destroyed. Essentially, they're back to the Stone Age. They had a few little bits and pieces and shards of glass and metal that seemed to be left over from some earlier age, but they know nothing about that earlier age. It had all been destroyed in the apocalypses that happened over the hundreds of years since. So this was very educational for his future self to come back to the past to see what the world was actually like when there were billions of people on the planet and we had technology. it was educational to Hank because he was able to go forward and see what the future world is going to look like and the kinds of problems that we're going to have to deal with, right? So that's what this book, Spirit Walker, is all about. As I said, it would just be an interesting fiction to read anyways, just in terms of a fictional book, a novel. But what Hank is saying is this is not fiction. This stuff really happened to him. These flipping back and forth from future to past actually happened to him. And he was able to get some veridical information to prove that it was real. And I'm not going to bother trying to go into it now because you'd need to know a lot about the story to understand the proof. So there you go. There's a couple of cases, a couple of examples of what I'm calling paired life, dual life experiences. So I think that's probably enough for people to try to swallow in terms of this entire lecture series. You know, this lecture series started out with how do our senses work and what's the nature of belief and the double slit experiment. So it started out with sort of somewhat conventional view of things, and it's gotten less and less conventional as we've gone through Unit 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, etc. I think we've reached the pinnacle of where we can go with this, in the pinnacle of getting bizarre when you start talking about flipping back and forth in and out of each other's bodies. We're getting really strange. I don't know what to say about that other than what I really wanted to try to accomplish in this series of lectures is to show you the breadth and scope of the things that have happened to people and the breadth and scope of our understanding of the non-physical. And this is not stuff that's just looked at by people, you know, burning incense and sitting in dark rooms. These are done by, a lot of this work is being done by people like Dean Radin, who is, you know, the chief scientist at IONS, which studies these sorts of things. And he is a classically trained scientist who has looked into a lot of these things and has found that these things are real. All right, so everyone needs to make these decisions on their own. Everyone needs to decide what their ability to believe is. I've gotten to the point where I believe enough of this stuff, and the stuff that I am not totally sold on, I have an open mind on. Whereas in the old days, the old me, I would simply discard it as pure poppycock. No, it's not poppycock. There's just too much evidence out there. So I'm encouraging you to follow the evidence. Assure yourself that it's valid evidence, but follow it if it is valid. And if you need to release old beliefs, do so. It takes courage. It's disorienting. It's difficult. You're going to take a lot of crap from people who think that you've lost your mind, but you've got to do what you've got to do. And I've always been a pretty grounded, down-to-earth person who lived by the rules and was convinced that science had all the answers. I am now convinced that science does not have all the answers, and science is actually really afraid of a lot of this stuff because it really breaks down their whole worldview. And so rather than take any of this stuff seriously, it's a lot easier just to diminish anyone who works on it and diminish the experiences completely, ignore them, come up with excuses to not believe it, because believing it requires you to, unfortunately, destroy your entire worldview and adopt a new one. And that's just too much to ask for a lot of people. So that's it. That's the long and the short of it. That's the soup to nuts. We have one more unit. We actually have two more units. One more unit is going to draw some conclusions that are I think, are pretty amazing conclusions. And then the final unit is, okay, where do we go from here? What do we do with the information we've acquired here? So that's it. I hope everyone's enjoyed this. I look forward to our next unit, which is Unit 12. And